Thank you for tuning in to the Bully Pew podcast, brought to you as always by the wonderful and intrepid and faithful supporters of Protestia.com, our insider supporters who keep this ministry going on an ongoing basis over at patreon.com/Protestia. If you are not already an insider supporter, we would humbly ask that you would consider joining us on a financial level. Special shout out to new patrons. We have some new patrons this week and last week. Thank you for joining the team. Hopefully you believe that it is worth your while, not only just in terms of the content and keeping this work going, but really just arguing for and supporting with your hard-earned dollars the validity of doing the work of discernment and polemics. This is something that we still have to in 2026. And considering the current state of things out in the world, the current state of things in the evangelical church, so on and so forth, we still have to contend very often within our own churches for the validity of doing this work. I'm blessed to be a member of a church that where contending for the validity of the work is not something we have to do, yet the work still needs to be done. That doesn't mean that we always agree on everything that we discuss. But there are some circles that you can run in and some churches you can go to where you have folks of the church, even pastors of the church, that basically act like doing polemics as a theological exercise, as a process, being discerning and having that be a focus of any ministry, much less a part of what every believer should do, is not valid in and of itself. That conflict in and of itself is pretty much automatically unchristian or wrong. Obviously, that, as we all know, that opens the door for potentially widespread and dangerous error when nobody will call something out. The second that somebody invokes the name of Jesus, we automatically let go of the issue and feel like we have to presume that person is not incorrect or not wrong or shouldn't be challenged or rebuked in any way. And that's just not the witness of Scripture. That's not the witness of the early church, not the witness of the New Testament. So much of the content of the especially the epistles and things like this are correcting error. They're dealing with problems within these local churches. Things that have grown, things that have kind of come within, enemies inside the gates, and it has to be argued against. It has to be fought in real ways, and so we continue on in that proud tradition. Now, if you are new around here and you want to know more about what we do, there's if you go over to Protestia.com and click on the About link, there is a drop down that will for other pages, but you could also just tap or click on the actual word about, and it will take you over to the long form description of what this ministry is and what we do, and why we believe it's important. There's also an FAQ that you can find in the drop down on the about menu that will explain a lot of the questions that we get asked frequently. Although quite honestly, less than we used to get asked. It used to be always a thing. Why do you guys always talking about what you're against, and why are you always so negative, and why do you think this is biblical? Those kind of questions they're less. We're getting asked them less, and it's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, that's a good thing, that it seems like Christians who are participating and engaging online understand that the argumentation aspect, the conflict aspect, the polemics aspect of all of it is to be expected and encouraged, but also, there's a lot more folks participating that may try to lead folks astray, may be in error, and so it's a double-edged sword. It's good that it seems like we're in a lot of ways past the idea that conflict, at least within online Christian conversations, that conflict is automatically wrong. It seems like we've gotten past that, but we still have to do the work. We still have to be in the conflict. We still have to actually parse the ideas with an open Bible, and be honest with each other about what's true and what isn't true out there. And there's a lot of untruth. On this Bully Pew podcast for today. It's Monday, April 27th, 2026, and I'm driving through a kind of a rainy central Denver. Yeah, it feels a little bit more like Seattle around here with all this rain, but around here it doesn't last very long, and we need it. I'm kind of in a drought condition, so as far as I'm concerned, let the rain keep coming as long as it wants to come, and we'll, the drivers around here are not very good. It seems a lot of new people to town that don't know where they're going. They don't know the streets. They don't know the lanes that they need to be in, and so on and so forth. And obviously the rain will only make that a little bit more challenging, but that's okay. That's okay, because you'll be listening to this Bully Pew podcast, not on the highway with me. So, but anyway, on this episode of the Bully Pew podcast, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Christian music industry, the worship industry. And obviously we've talked about this a lot before. It is a particular interest of mine as a musician, a particular peeve of mine, considering the nature or the current status of Christian, especially praise and worship music. But some of you may have noticed, like if you're patron supporters, you've probably seen every once in a while I will drop a worship track or something that I'm working on onto Patreon. Usually not in a final form, but pretty close to a final form. Those posts, they don't get a ton of engagement, so it makes me wonder, like, maybe I think I could admit that maybe that's not what folks are coming to protest day for, is to hear worship music. Particularly, it's still something that is, of course, right in the middle of the polemics and discernment conversation. But certainly, I think we'll be, maybe exploring the idea of having a different, maybe a different patronage kind of a thing for those who are interested in that kind of, in worship music, and getting, things maybe for their churches and whatnot that they could potentially use in worship. We'll see. We're keeping the doors open as far as what the best way to do that is. But I'm certainly open to the idea that dropping praise and worship songs in the middle of discernment and polemics content and news content and these kinds of things may not be the best place for it might be too much crossing streams. So we'll see. But the point that I'm making is that I wanted to talk. Those of you that have been around here for a while, that Christian music, worship music, the Christian contemporary music industry as such, and whatnot, is a particular interest and focus of mine. And from a discernment and polemics perspective, it's interesting to watch, and really even from a music industry perspective, interesting to watch how things have morphed in the last, really the last 10 years or so. We would have said that the 2010s, were sort of the high point for a lot of these church-based worship band movements. The Hillsongs, Hillsong United being kind of their worship band, releasing albums and things. And of course you have Elevation Worship, you have, Passion and that sort of, that sphere. And then you have, Gateway Worship down in Texas. You have Bethel, of course, that's was a big name for a long time. All of these movements, in some shape, manner, or form, coming out of charismaticism, as we all know. That's not a coincidence, given the potential, the subjective and emotional nature that's usually linked with music in general. But then all of these movements really, having either scandals or having sort of the shine come off in the eyes of a lot of mainstream evangelicalism. And then to see in the 2020s more individuals, and frankly, they're individuals that are coming out of the same movements, but they're not being presented and marketed as being church movements. It's something that gave, at least when this phenomenon started, at the beginning of music streaming and all of this, and then you see a lot of Christian music consumption shifting towards praise and worship music rather than albums and things. When I grew up, it was, oh yeah, here's a DC Talk album, here's an Amy Grant album, here's Stephen Curtis Chapman album. You had Christian bands sort of spanning genres. Here's here's the OC Supertones playing Christian ska. Here's Five Iron Frenzy playing Christian ska out of Denver. I mean, all this it was kind of a Christian facsimile of the secular music industry, and largely I thought it was a good thing. And yet then when we got to the point where in the music industry albums were and recorded music was not selling the way that it used to, 25 years ago, and artists were relying on streaming, which you can't really rely on anyway. The album sale revenue was declining sharply. You had a lot of Christian music listening shifted over to praise and worship music, and these groups putting their songs, writing songs as church bands, as sort of parachurch movements coming out of specific large charismatic megachurches, and with the idea of we're going to write music and we're going to market it towards worship pastors and towards churches and try to get this stuff into use in the church, generate revenue from CCLI licensing instead of album sales. And yet, because the Christians in these churches are still dutiful consumers of Christian books and movies and all these kinds of things, they were still selling albums as well. And you get into the 2010s and you have Hillsong and Bethel, and Jesus Culture, of course, is a Bethel project. You have Stephen Furtick and Elevation Worship. Stephen Furtick being, and I don't know what his actual musical ability is, but he's credited on pretty much all of their songs. So we have to assume he's a musician of sorts. Music coming out of Elevation, over in North Carolina. You have music coming out of, and then some of the, you might say the second tier or, movements like Andy Stanley's North Point Church. North Point Worship's got stuff coming out, and Gateway Worship down in Texas. Robert Morris's church down there. They're releasing things, and these things are specifically marketed towards the music getting into rotations at ma and pa evangelical churches around the country. We're talking, 150 to 1,000 member, or 150 to 1,000 attendees on a weekend kind of churches. And their praise teams are basically emulating in format and in ways of doing things all of these big sort of church worship movements. And yet between then and now, you have, the Robert Morris scandal, the Cindy Clemenshire thing. Robert Morris goes down in scandal. Apparently he just got out of jail, so justice not quite being served in that one, in my opinion. But that certainly tarnishes the Gateway name. You have the Hillsong scandals, Carl Lentz, Brian Houston covering up for his father, Frank Houston's, pedophilia and things like this. I thought it was that anyway. But I mean, sexual sin from Frank Houston being covered up by Brian Houston, sullying the Hillsong name, Carl Lentz sullying the Hillsong name. Hillsong has not released anything official, as far as I know, for 3-4 years at this point. You have the Bethel brand, as videos and teaching and things of Bethel start to get spread out among regular evangelical churches and pastors. Grave soaking and having services where they're praying for a little girl to come back from the dead and all this kind of, this really kooky stuff. And so you don't see so much coming from Bethel or Jesus Culture officially as much as you see the publishing arm still working. And then the names, the Brandon Lakes of the world coming out of Bethel, who are releasing stuff under their own names, collaborations with, some of these worship collectives like Maverick City Music and things. And there's been a splintering of it in terms of the branding. And so that makes discerning it harder for a lot of pastors, a lot of churches. They very often find it easier to just say, hey, no Bethel around here. No Bethel around here. And yet there can be, to give you an example, Bethel music can still sneak into churches because other artists will record the songs. So you might have a song that's written, within the Bethel ecosystem, and still pushing some of the the sort of kooky theology that it pushes in the lyrics of the song, or sort of hidden in between, some just basic Christian truths that they'll put in the songs. And then instead of having, Brian and Jen Johnson on the song or something like this, they'll say, well, here's the CC Winans version. Here's the Goodness of God, which is a Bethel song, but CC Winans is doing it, and so it winds up in churches that would have ordinarily said, we don't sing Bethel. It gets laundered in like that, and it's number one, it's because a lot of worship pastors and church leadership, they're not going to that second or third level of discernment when they bring this stuff in. But it's also because they're just not being very careful with discerning the song itself and the words in the song itself, and actually parsing them and really taking stock of what are we saying here. Because even if you don't use the associational baggage as a primary discernment tipping point, even if you say, hey, we're not just going to write stuff off based off of the songwriter or the movement or the primary artist that the song is known for or whatever, you can still take the song in and of itself and find with most of this stuff, and some of it's way worse than others, but even with the ones that are quote unquote safe, there's still some telltale signs if you're being careful to parse the text of the song and say, what are we actually saying? And again, as I've said, and as of course we argue for over at Protestia, having a theology of worship that is focused on, for lack of a better way to say it, no pun intended, elevating the content of what we bring into our worship services, from a perspective of all of this being extra biblical material. Our standards should be sky high. They should be entirely scriptural. And with all of the material out there, there's no reason really, no real practical reason why we need to settle for things that we have to make excuses for. We settle for things that, if a song it's really artistically well done, it's set up well for a congregation, it's, all pretty much generally true scripturally, and then you have one troublesome phrase, that's all it should take for you to toss it out. There's plenty of other stuff out there. You don't need to, make excuses for it or try to work around something that you really can't be excused away. And the reason the churches do it is because they know that these songs they're on the radio, they're within the evangelical culture, they're being sung at other churches. It's market awareness, and that's a big problem. That we're still in some ways, especially in worship music, under the spell of church growth methodology, where we're still looking at congregations, our congregations that have membership or attendees all across the spectrum of Christian maturity, and we're programming the music down to the lowest common denominator, rather than elevating the music within the worship service and then being prepared for the questions that should come, hopefully, if we're open in inviting of these things, should come from the less mature members in the congregation when they ask, what does that mean? What's propitiation? Or whatever we put in the song, like what do those lyrics mean? And then it's an opportunity for teaching. But instead we're looking at the mega church down the street, and we're saying, oh man, they're playing the latest thing from Phil Wickham, and so we got to play the latest thing from Phil Wickham. Those people, they want to hear what they hear on Christian radio, which again is the lowest common denominator theologically, always is. And these songs are written that way. They're written to be to be widely appealing, no matter what you actually happen to believe from a theological perspective, no matter what you actually practice. Some of these songs, you could be an Orthodox Jew and sing some of these songs and not have a problem with it. You can be Roman Catholic, sing this song, not have a problem with it. You can be a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon, or basically any theological, quote unquote spiritual persuasion that invokes God at all, and some of these songs will work, and they're structured that way. Evangelical churches for a long time have been playing songs and performing things in worship services by Matt Maher, who's a Roman Catholic, with no problem at all, because the song doesn't get specific enough about the person and work of Christ to make a Roman Catholic feel kind of uncomfortable with it, And so, but anytime that we're worshiping musically in a service, there's multiple things going on. There's praise to God, there's edification, there's teaching. People remember things that they hear in songs. That sticks with them even more than sermons. And so, but to get back to the CCM industry, it's going to become more difficult, I think, with the splintering of some of these big worship movements as the scandals have kind of caught up with them. And instead, you're going to see individual artists who can say, yeah, I mean, I went to the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry, but I don't lead with that. This is the Brandon Lake phenomenon, where he puts out some. I mean, just some of the most popular songs are just comically generic. I mean, rewind the clock 30 or 40 years, and we're like, this isn't fit for children's church. This isn't fit for the 5 and 6 year olds as far as what it's actually saying. And yet, we have basically youth group for adults going on in so many churches still. They don't even see that it's a problem. The actual lyrical content of their worship music is just childish. It's something that serious-minded churches who take Scripture seriously are going to have to come to terms with. And I think I'll leave you with this, because there's still a lot more to say about this. Again, it is the big thing to take away is from the 2010s and the big worship movements. Now we have the 2020s, and it's splintered all over the place. Obviously, the social media phenomenon where a lot of people learn about new music through social media, AI music becoming a force and a thing where people don't know, is this a real person or not? It's going to become that much more important that we focus on and that we have a rock solid and operable theology of worship for our churches where we know here's why we're going to bring material in. By what standard are we going to use this song or not use it or whatnot? That's going to become very, very important going forward. But I'll leave you with this. I think that this is hopefully a sign of good things to come in some ways. It seems like the younger generation right now, the generation that are my kids' age, they're high schoolers or young college, this kind of generation. It seems like there's some pushback really at a cultural level against the fleetness or the temporary, non-tangible, sort of fake nature of social media and internet culture right now. That it seems like some of the younger folks are pushing back on this. They're basically saying, that like there's a lot of interest in, retro technology and retro cultural things and, things from the 80s and the 90s. The younger generation seems to be real interested in this stuff and sometimes to the exclusion of whatever the supposed latest and greatest thing out there is. Like they've had enough of sort of the TikTok cycle of content where anything that is that's out there is here 1 minute and gone the next. Nothing feels solid. Nothing feels like it lasts. Everything is temporary. Everything's an illusion. Obviously, the COVID period, the 2020, 2021 really pushed this idea that like, what is real? Where can I find things that I can hold on to? I think it's part of the reason that young men in Christian spaces, for lack of a better way to say it, I guess, in Christian conversations and communities, are gravitating towards traditions like Roman Catholicism and in Eastern Orthodoxy. It feels, at least aesthetically speaking, to them like it's more solid, like it's been around, like it's not moving. And meanwhile, evangelical churches are busy, having the latest program and the latest gimmick, and come over and visit our church for this life-changing thing. We're giving away Chick-fil-A for a year, and these gimmicks that evangelicalism has been involved in, and it seems to young men and women really, but especially young men, that we see that that Eastern Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism don't do that. They're just, they feel old and secure and solid. They feel like they have a connection with the past, and Protestantism, Protestant traditions, Baptist churches, Presbyterian churches still have this rich history that they can tap into and stay connected with if they're willing to do it. And I think that may have a, for lack of a better way to say it, an attractional impact on young Christians, rather than saying, your faith and what we do around here and how we practice things and what our church does and our programs and our imaging and our, whatever is, very carefully market curated. And if the market changes, we're ready. We're ready to change with it. To young people that all they've known growing up is illusion and temporary things, and nothing feels really solid, that similarly will not feel very solid for them. And so I think there might be an opportunity for doctrinally serious, gospel-minded evangelical churches to return more to an aesthetic, a practice, a programming, an ecclesiology that is much more in keeping with tradition, evangelical tradition, than it is with what's the latest fad is. Programming worship services on Sunday morning with music that is old and has been around and has rich and deep theological truth, and not responding to, well, that megachurch down the street is doing the latest, helicopter egg drop, Mario sermon, pyrotechnics, kiddie ball pit version of a Sunday morning service. Let's not do that. Let's give these young people something that is legitimately tangible and solid and been around for a long time and connects generations, and that truly feels, because it is, but truly is a safe place to be from a scriptural and doctrinal perspective. That's what they're looking for. They're not looking for the latest, doom scrolling, viral content. They're looking for something that feels like it's not going to go away tomorrow. Like it's going to be here tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day, and they're going to pass it on to their kids, and their kids are going to pass it on to their kids. There's an opportunity here, and it hopefully, God willing, this can start with worship ministry. We'll see. That's certainly when I write songs and as I'm trying to build material here, that's what I'm going for. Something that could be handed down. Something it's not going to be the latest, 5-word repetition hype thing chasing the cultural fad and the cultural musical fads around like so much of CCM actually is. So, but again, thank you for joining me on this Bully Pew podcast. Again, it's the 27th of April, 2026. And you were riding around with me in Studio C. That's the car, of course. And then we'll be posting this up later today. And I'm continuing to, as much as I can, as much as time will allow and whatnot, trying to produce some of this content. But yes, the jury's still out on exactly what the best way to get it out there is. We'll see. Hopefully we can get some good solid churches and things and small churches, medium-sized churches, big churches, whoever, to start replacing some of these vacuous, honestly, theologically speaking, not even fit for children's church kind of stuff that has dominated Christian praise and worship for, the last really 15, 20 years. Hopefully we can get churches to replace that stuff with not only the hymns of old, things that are, much more doctrinally rich and solid and just different from what the world is doing, but some new stuff that still follows that trend. There are good worship songwriters out there right now, but they're getting, the noise is all in the emotional, basic, fill in the blank, focus on me kind of stuff that we see coming out of the elevations and the hill songs and the Bethels, and really the people that are connected with those. But I mean, you still have some Keith and Kristen Gettys out there that are doing decent stuff. You still, City of Light is doing some decent stuff. Hopefully this will open the door for the next crop of songwriters to do things that are more fitting and more appropriate for truly exalted Christian worship. And we're going to try to, as much as we can, be in that mix, and we'll see where God takes it. Thank you for listening to this Bully P podcast. As always, stay tuned to protestia.com for your latest in Christian polemics and discernment news. Patrons, if you have questions, always available via Patreon messages, checking that pretty much daily. For everybody else, we'll try to get to comments if I can. If not, no hard feelings. But we will catch you later. Again, stay tuned to Protestio. Semper Reformanda.